Yes, that was the last fight of my deal. I told you last time we spoke after the fight that I wanted to test free agency, test the water, see whatever. I know what I think I'm worth. I know what I am worth.
So right now, the UFC is cracking under pressure like never before, and fighters, they're walking away for better pay, and Dana White is absolutely not having it. What looked like this unstoppable powerhouse of elite fighters is suddenly losing control. And there's this one moment that exposed everything. Very shocking stuff. I've got all the details, so let's get into it. UFC fighters are leaving in numbers we haven't seen before. I'm going to start with the truth the UFC never wanted you to hear, because hiding the lead here would be doing a disservice to what's actually happening behind the scenes. The UFC, the so-called untouchable giant of combat sports, is losing fighters left and right. And not by accident either. Their own system is finally collapsing under the weight of its outdated pay structure. And the moment that exposed all of this, it didn't happen in some courtroom or through a leaked email. It happened in a quiet studio during a simple sit-down interview when a fighter the UFC never expected to lose walked in, sat down, and calmly revealed that he was leaving the company because he'd finally discovered something better. What he shared wasn't just surprising, it was genuinely humiliating for the UFC. Because for the first time, a fighter didn't say he wanted to leave. He said he had to, and when you hear the reason in his own words, you begin to understand why insiders are whispering that this is the moment where the UFC is no longer the only throne in the kingdom, and Dana White is no longer the one holding the crown. It begins with Shane Burgos stepping into that studio, smiling, composed, carrying the kind of secret that could shift the entire balance of fighter pay in MMA. He delivers the blow that sent panic rippling through UFC headquarters, and you can hear it in the clip itself. The moment his decision becomes impossible to ignore.
When all's said and done after the first season, when I plan on winning, I'll be a multimillionaire.
And then, with absolutely no hesitation, he drops the bombshell. He announces that he's signing with PFL. That moment wasn't just a signing announcement. It was a statement. It told the entire world that a fighter the UFC had built, promoted, and relied on was now leaving because someone else, someone outside the UFC's so-called kingdom, valued him more. It struck directly at the UFC's ego, and if you listen closely to what comes next, you realize why this wasn't just a fighter changing promotions. It was a fighter exposing the UFC's financial limits. Because when Shane is asked whether the UFC tried to match the PFL offer, his answer slices right through the myth that the UFC can outbid anyone whenever they choose. They couldn't. It was that good of a deal. Those words are devastating precisely because they're so simple. Not they wouldn't. Not they didn't want to, but they could. For a company that constantly brags about being the largest MMA organization in the world, being outbid this aggressively throws a spotlight on a truth fans have suspected for years. The UFC pays far less than their fighters are truly worth, and they know it. What made this moment even more powerful is that Shane wasn't leaving out of anger. He wasn't slamming the organization or burning bridges. In fact, he practically went out of his way to speak respectfully, which only makes this story more painful for the UFC. Because when a fighter leaves emotionally, it's easy for the company to spin it as bitterness. But Shane left with gratitude. He thanked them, praised them, appreciated them, and then still had to walk away for the sake of his family. It's one thing when a disgruntled fighter leaves, it's another when a loyal soldier realizes loyalty doesn't pay the bills. And Shane doesn't stop there. When he's asked whether this PFL deal is the biggest money of his career, he doesn't even hesitate. Not even close. Those 3 words summarize everything wrong with the UFC's pay model. A fighter with 11 UFC fights, 11 high-impact, high-damage, high-entertainment performances, had to leave the organization to make what he calls real money. That's not an isolated case, that's a symptom of a larger, deeper issue the UFC keeps trying to patch with performance bonuses and promotional hype. But nothing exposes the financial gap more than this next statement. Shane talks about what the PFL deal truly means for his life. And it is something you will never hear a mid-tier UFC fighter say.
I'm also pay fighters more, you know? And I know Dana's running a business, and he's a great businessman, so can he give out the checks that we want as fighters? That's like a business decision, you know? I obviously have always advocated throughout my career, and now that I'm retired even more money for the fighters, because it's a fucking tough job.
Multi-millionaire. After one season. Think about the message that sends. Not to Dana White, not to the executives, but to every fighter sitting on a UFC contract, wondering whether they're wasting the prime of their life on a pay scale that hasn't evolved in 20 years. When a fighter can earn generational wealth in the PFL faster than they can earn financial security in the UFC, that whole UFC is the dream narrative starts to sound less like reality and more like a sales pitch. And yet, even after all that, Shane remained respectful. He didn't bury the UFC, didn't call them cheap, didn't make accusations. Instead, he spoke with genuine gratitude for the platform. That's exactly why his departure hurts the UFC more than any public rant or angry exit ever could. It's the polite, heartfelt breakup that stings the deepest. It's that it's not you, it's the money moment. Because it forces the UFC to acknowledge the truth. Their fighters are no longer afraid to walk, no longer afraid to test free agency, and no longer convinced that the UFC is the only path to success. And that is the very thing Dana White has spent 2 decades trying to prevent. Shane's calm, respectful exit created a ripple effect because it undermined the UFC's favorite defense mechanism, the idea that fighters who leave are simply unhappy or ungrateful. But here was a fighter who loved the company, loved the platform, loved the fans, and still felt financially cornered. That alone should have triggered every alarm bell in the UFC's executive offices. Fighters aren't supposed to realize their value, aren't supposed to compare options, aren't supposed to walk away from the so-called top promotion in the world simply because another organization respects their worth. Yet that is exactly what happened. And the message it sends is bigger than any single contract negotiation. It tells the entire roster that loyalty to the UFC may earn you appreciation, but it will never guarantee your future. And that's why Dana White's reaction behind the scenes mattered so much. Dana has always operated under the belief that the UFC is the pinnacle, the goal, the dream, the only destination that matters. For years he dismissed the idea of fighters going anywhere else as unrealistic. Where are they going to go? Was his favorite line. The UFC positioned itself as the major leagues, and everything else as amateur hour. But PFL signing a fighter like Shane Burgos, not at the end of his career, not washed, not desperate, but in his prime, ready to deliver world-class performances, directly contradicts that narrative. It proves that somewhere else now exists, that somewhere else can pay better, and that somewhere else is becoming attractive to fighters who, under normal circumstances, would never consider leaving. What makes this shift even more powerful is Shane's honesty about how painful the decision truly was. It wasn't a triumph or escape, wasn't a rebellious walkout. It was a heavy, emotionally loaded choice that he struggled with for days. That is the part that exposes the UFC the most, because someone who genuinely loved the company still couldn't justify staying because the money simply didn't make sense anymore. Listen to his voice in this part of the clip, when he reveals how torn he was. This isn't a fighter running from the UFC, it's a fighter outgrowing it, and that's what makes Dana White so uneasy. When fighters leave because they're angry, Dana can dismiss them as emotional or irrational. When fighters leave because they can't win fights, he can frame it as a talent issue. But when fighters leave because another organization is simply willing to pay them what they deserve, it challenges the entire foundation the UFC is built upon, the belief that fighters need the UFC more than the UFC needs fighters. Shane's departure represents the first major crack in that foundation, not because he's the biggest star the UFC ever had, but because he's the kind of star the UFC relies on the most. Exciting, loyal, a guaranteed action fight. These are the athletes the UFC uses to build cards, support rising stars, fill fight night main events, and keep fans engaged, week after week. And now that type of fighter is realizing he can build a better future outside the UFC's control. If one Shane Burgos realizes it, more will consider it. If 2 consider it, 10 will think about it. And once 10 fighters realize they have legitimate financial alternatives, Dana White's power starts to fade. But the most dangerous part for the UFC isn't that one fighter left, it's that Shane openly stated the PFL could make him a millionaire faster than the UFC ever did. That fact alone functions as a recruitment commercial for the PFL, whether he intended it or not. Fighters talk, gyms talk, managers talk, and when they hear a mid-tier UFC contender could become a multi-millionaire in a single PFL season, they start doing the math. Many of them have been taking damage for years, without even breaking 6 figures per fight, and now they're hearing that the path to real financial stability might exist outside the UFC's wall. Shane's honesty spreads faster than any promotional slogan, because it comes from a place of real experience. He isn't selling anything, isn't marketing the PFL, he's simply explaining why he chose financial security over brand loyalty. And it's impossible to dismiss the emotional weight behind his decision when he talks about his daughter. The UFC can argue about fighter pay all they want, but they cannot argue with a father explaining that he made his decision so he could look his children in the eyes and know he gave them the life they deserve. That's not a negotiation tactic, not a publicity move. That's reality, and that reality is now public. The UFC has always relied on tight control over the narrative. Who deserves what? Who's worth what? Who earns enough? Who complains too much? But the moment Shane calmly stated that the UFC couldn't match the PFL's offer, and then admitted that the PFL deal would turn him into a multi-millionaire, the UFC lost control of the story. They could no longer hide the uncomfortable truth that their pay scale is no longer competitive with a promotion they once considered irrelevant. The fans feel the shift, the fighters feel the shift, and quietly, even the UFC feels the shift. The truth is simple. The UFC still has the biggest brand, the biggest platform, the biggest spotlight, but the fighters, the actual beating heart of the sport, are learning that fame means nothing if your bank account still says you're replaceable. Shane Burgos was not a superstar, but he was beloved, respected. He earned his place through blood, sweat, and unforgettable wars. If even he felt financially trapped inside the UFC system, then countless others are surely feeling the exact same pressure. And that's why this moment is bigger than PFL versus UFC, bigger than one contract, bigger than one fighter. This moment represents a turning point, the first real sign that the UFC's longtime grip on the sport is weakening. Not because someone is trying to compete with them, but because fighters are finally realizing they don't have to accept less than what they're worth. Shane didn't want to leave the UFC. That's what makes this story so powerful. He had to. And when fighters start doing things out of necessity, rather than emotion, that's when entire systems begin to crack. The aftermath of Shane Burgos' departure didn't stay contained within one interview studio. It rippled outward through gyms, locker rooms, management offices, and private group chats, where fighters talk more honestly than they ever do in front of cameras. You could feel the vibration almost immediately. If he could leave, why couldn't others? If he could test the market and win, what was stopping the rest of them? And that is exactly where the UFC's real problem began. Not with Shane himself, but with the psychological shift he triggered across the entire roster. For years, the UFC relied on silence. Fighters weren't supposed to compare paychecks, weren't supposed to ask what others earned, weren't supposed to question why a sport built on sacrifice and danger pays a fraction of what other major sports pay their athletes. The UFC perfected the art of distraction, big walkouts, explosive promo packages, performance of the night bonuses that sounded generous but rarely fixed the underlying issue. But when Shane shared how significantly the PFL valued him, it tore a hole in that illusion. The UFC's fighters began asking themselves a simple question they had avoided for too long. What am I really worth? What followed was a quiet but unmistakable shift in tone among fighters still under contract. Interviews that once sounded grateful began to sound cautious. Press conferences that once praised the UFC's opportunity began to include subtle hints of financial frustration. Even fighters who had never spoken publicly about pay began acknowledging that free agency wasn't just a risk, it was an option. And the UFC, whether they admitted it publicly or not, felt the pressure of that change. One of the strongest signs of this shift came from fighters discussing the emotional and physical toll of staying loyal to a system that didn't reward them proportionally. The message from Shane resonated more deeply than anyone expected because it wasn't the words of a disgruntled veteran, it was the testimony of a fighter still very much in the competitive prime of his career. And when he said openly and without bitterness that he loved the UFC but had to leave for the sake of his future, fighters listened. They understood the subtext. Loyalty doesn't pay the bills, and gratitude doesn't protect your family when your fighting years are over. What made the situation even more volatile was the timing. The UFC had already taken hits to its public image regarding fighter pay, questions about revenue splits, lawsuits challenging the company's labor practices, former champions publicly stating they left the UFC richer than they ever were inside it. But Shane's story wasn't tainted by personal conflict. Wasn't fueled by rivalry or tension or a damaged relationship. It was a clean, rational, almost painfully honest break, and that is exactly what made it so dangerous for the UFCs. Meanwhile, PFL continued positioning itself strategically. They didn't just sign Shane as a fighter, they treated him like an investment. They offered him a platform, visibility, and financial security that spoke directly to the needs UFC fighters had been whispering about for years. To the outside world, it may have looked like one organization taking advantage of another's misstep, but to fighters it looked like the emergence of something they never expected: leverage. And leverage is something the UFC never wanted fighters to discover. You can see that tension reflected indirectly in the UFC's response, or lack of one. Dana White did comment on Shane leaving, but his tone carried an unusual mix of respect and disappointment. There's a moment from a UFC post-fight press conference that fans still refer to when discussing this situation. Dana was asked about losing Shane Burgos to the PFL, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't sound defiant. He sounded frustrated, caught off guard. With that line, "We should have re-signed him," as the closest you will ever get to Dana White admitting the UFC dropped the ball. It was an acknowledgement that someone important slipped through their fingers, and more importantly, that the UFC wasn't prepared for the possibility that mid-tier fighters could become too expensive to keep. That admission echoed through the MMA world, because if the UFC can accidentally lose a fighter as entertaining and reliable as Shane, it creates the impression that no one is truly safe. Not even the athletes who delivered the fights fans rave about. And once fighters feel replaceable, they start checking the exit doors. They start paying attention to other promotions' prize money, sponsorship opportunities, and long-term career paths. Suddenly, the UFC logo on the gloves means less than the numbers on the contract. The bigger issue for the UFC is that every fighter understands the fragility of his career. One injury can end everything. One bad knockout can permanently alter their lives. One training accident can shut down a future they worked decades to build. So when Shane explains, with complete honesty, that he had to choose financial security over emotional attachment, fighters see themselves in his decision. They see the version of their life where they stay loyal and end up with medical bills instead of retirement saving. They see the version where their children grow up watching their father walk with a limp, but without the financial cushion that might have made that sacrifice worth it. And that emotional truth cuts deeper than any debate about contracts or promotions, because beneath all the marketing, all the lights, all the belts, and all the bravado, every fighter knows one thing: the window to make real money is incredibly small. The UFC has benefited from fighters ignoring that truth for years, but now, thanks to fighters like Shane openly discussing their financial realities, that window comes into focus. What Shane did wasn't just leave. He turned on the light. He exposed how many fighters have been competing in the dark, unaware of their true value, controlled by the belief that the UFC was the end-all be-all of MMA success. And when the lights come on, people start noticing cracks in the wall. They start noticing the parts of the system that don't make sense. They start noticing how much money the UFC generates versus how much money trickles down to the fighters. And once they see it, they can't unsee it. This is why Shane's departure has been described as the opening bell of a new era in MMA economics. It wasn't dramatic in tone, but it was devastating in impact. It wasn't angry, but it was revealing. It didn't burn bridges, but it burned illusions. And the UFC, for all its power and prestige, cannot extinguish the simple truth he exposed. Fighters have options now, and some of those options pay more, much more. That understanding alone has created a level of uncertainty within the UFC that they have never had to face before. It has forced fighters to reevaluate their contracts, managers to rethink negotiation strategies, and fans to question whether the UFC's dominance is as absolute as it once seemed. But the real shockwave, the one that truly threatens the UFC's control, comes from what happens next, from the fighters who followed Shane's lead, tested their own markets, and discovered that the UFC might not be the best financial home after all. Shane Burgos wasn't the last crack in the dam, he was the first. By the time Shane Burgos finished explaining his decision, the UFC already sensed that something irreversible had begun, but what they didn't expect was how quickly the effect would spread and how deeply it would cut into the core of what made their empire stable for so long. Because once that first fighter leaves for better pay, others begin to re-examine their own situations. And once enough fighters question the system, the UFC loses the secret weapon it relied on for nearly 2 decades. What happened next wasn't loud or public at first. It happened quietly in the training rooms where fighters taped their wrists before sparring, in the locker rooms after hard sessions, in late-night texts between veterans and prospects, and in private conversations with managers who suddenly had a new bargaining chip in their hand. For the first time in years, the UFC was not the center of every negotiation, not the automatic choice, not the only path to financial survival. And that shift, subtle at first, quickly turned into a groundswell. More fighters started studying Shane's interview. They watched it not for entertainment, but for answers. They listened to his voice looking for signs of regret or fear, and instead found something else entirely. Relief. Relief that someone from the inside had finally said out loud what most had only dared to think privately. Relief that someone had broken the spell and shown that leaving the UFC didn't mean disappearing into obscurity. It could actually mean entering a new chapter of abundance. Managers began using Shane Burgos's deal as a reference point, reminding the UFC that other organizations were now offering multi-million-dollar opportunities. And because the information was coming from a fighter who left respectfully, not a disgruntled former champion or a recently cut veteran, the UFC couldn't easily dismiss it. They weren't dealing with noise, they were dealing with evidence. Meanwhile, other promotions gained confidence. They understood the gravity of what they had accomplished. By signing Shane, they didn't just land a talented fighter, they proved a point, and once a promotion proves it can compete with the UFC for talent, that promotion stops being a feeder league and starts becoming a true competitor. Even One Championship and Bellator watched closely, taking note of how fighters reacted to the possibility of better pay, more freedom, and improved long-term security outside the UFC's long shadow. Suddenly, fighters had options, and options create pressure. That pressure began showing in the UFC's behavior. They re-signed fighters more quickly than usual. They shut down talks about free agency the moment they began. They quietly increased certain offers, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Dana White even shifted his tone about competing organizations, sometimes dismissing them publicly while negotiating more aggressively behind closed doors. That duality, confidence on the outside, urgency on the inside, was the first sign that the UFC was truly feeling the heat. But the most significant indicator of change came from the fighters themselves. Some began speaking cautiously in interviews about exploring their value. Others admitted that they were watching the PFL closely. A few even openly criticized the UFC's pay structure in ways that would have been unthinkable a few years earlier. And all of this was underpinned by the new awareness that Shane had planted. If you are good enough, exciting enough, and willing to test the water, there might be something bigger waiting for you outside the UFC's gates. The UFC tried, as it always does, to regain control of the narrative. Dana White made comments about how not every fighter can be paid like a superstar. He repeated the familiar lines about how the UFC gives fighters a massive platform, but none of those lines hit as strongly as they used to, because fighters now had an example of someone who walked away from that platform and still ended up with a better financial future. That fact alone weakened every talking point the UFC used to keep its roster disciplined. And that brings us to the heart of why so many people, fans, analysts, insiders began whispering the phrase, the UFC is not because the UFC will collapse tomorrow, not because the brand will disappear, but because the UFC's dominant grip over fighter pay, over fighter loyalty, over fighter options, is no longer absolute. The aura of invincibility has cracked, the monopoly of opportunity has been challenged. The assumption that fighters need the UFC more than the UFC needs fighters is no longer a universal truth. What truly threatens the UFC is not competition, it's empowerment. It's the moment fighters realize that the risk of leaving is no longer greater than the reward of staying. Shane Burgos gave fighters something the UFC never wanted them to have: perspective. He showed that the cage door does not lock from the inside, that the UFC's lights are bright but not irreplaceable, that the title UFC fighter might be prestigious, but prestige does not pay for your children's future. Dana White knows. You can hear it in his tone in the clip where he admits the company should have kept Shane. It isn't his typical dismissive posture. There's a rare vulnerability there, a recognition that the UFC might be losing control of the very system it built. When he says that losing Shane was a mistake, he's not talking about entertainment value, he's talking about leverage. The UFC lost a fighter who represented everything they claimed to value, and they lost him because they couldn't offer him what he deserved, and that is the true turning point. The UFC remains big, remains powerful, remains influential, but it no longer holds the only key. Fighters now see paths the UFC never wanted them to see. They see opportunities Dana cannot control. They see futures that aren't tied to the UFC's restrictive contracts or its unpredictable bonuses. They see that walking away doesn't mean career suicide, it can mean financial rebirth. The UFC has survived scandals, lawsuits, controversies, and countless challenges, but the one threat it cannot conquer is the collective awakening of its fighters. And that awakening has begun. It started in a quiet studio, with a simple interview spoken calmly by a fighter who didn't want to leave, but had no other choice. And from that moment on, the UFC was no longer the only game in town. Shane Burgos didn't just secure his future, he changed the future of the sport. And Dana White, whether he admits it or not, knows that the moment fighters realize their value, the UFC's era of unchecked dominance begins to fade. The UFC isn't finished as a company, but the idea of the UFC as the only road to greatness, that era is ending. And Shane Burgos was the first one to walk through the door that others are now lining up to follow.